United States. On the other hand, of course, China, which wasn't a superpower in 1950, but it started to become one after defeating the UN forces inside North Korea to shock the world. So this is the moment in modern history when China rises to superpowerdom. But of course, for the Korean people, it was a vast and terrible tragedy. And what I'd like to sort of tell you today, I'm not going to give you a long history. I'm not going to give you dates and places. I just want to tell you some stories about the men who came here to fight for this country and what their experiences were. And if you can just remember some of these, many tragic and sad stories, to me, that is the important thing. I'm not interested in the politics of presidents or generals. I was much more interested, what was it like to be in Korea in 1950, in 1951, when this country was torn apart? Were the first troops to arrive after the Americans and their fight around Busan, Incheon, then up into North Korea. And the second and probably the most important part of the presentation is 70 years ago this day, the British Army fought the bloodiest battle in its modern history here in Korea at the Imjingang, the Imjin River. So I'm going to break my presentation into two parts: the early stage of the war, then the big battles in 1951, and what it means for Britain and for Korea in posterity. And Jenny, are we taking a 5-minute break in the middle, or are we just going for 2 hours? Take a look at this picture. There we go.
Yeah. That
was shot in April 1951, and it's a very familiar sight to you Koreans. This is a pine tree. You can see the mountains. That is the Imjin Valley, and this is the sea of clouds. And this photograph was taken by British soldiers in the Imjin Valley 70 years ago to this day. That was actually taken on Sunday, 22nd of April, which was a very beautiful, relaxing spring day in Korea, completely peaceful. But by that night, that photograph was taken in the morning, those hilltops would be islands in the human wave, because that night, 22nd of April 1951, would be the biggest Chinese attack of the entire Korean War, and indeed the biggest communist offensive anywhere in the world since 1945. So here's what it looked like on the ground. You can see the hills in the background, the river just here, and in the front you can just see a couple of camouflage British soldiers with their machine gun pointing towards the river, waiting for what will come across. And more broadly, this is kind of the view of Korea in those days. The long ridge lines, the darkening sky, and of course this war-torn landscape from the artillery fire in the distance, and the sound of thunder, the sound of artillery. But what were these young British men doing in Korea in April 1951? Remember, Korea is a place many people had never even heard of at that time before international travel. Well, as you're Korean, I think you all know this, but Korea, of course, has the benefit and has the liability of being very strategic. It's between Russia, it's between Manchuria, between China, between Japan, and more recently between America. So for logistics, for business, this is great. But of course, 50 years ago, when there was a major ideological war in the region, this was a bad time and place for the region. And of course, Korea in 1945 was cut in half by the great powers who had won World War II. I think you'll recognize this guy who takes power in North Korea, and I think you'll recognize this guy who takes power in South Korea. And of course, once these two competing states are set up in Korea, against the wishes, of course, of the average Korean person, we know bad things are going to happen. Ri Sing-man and Kim Il-sung never met each other. if they had met each other, probably only one person would have left the room alive, because these are men who represent vastly different systems, and civil war is now on the horizon. Civil war breaks out on 25th of June 1950, and this is a painting by Kim Sung-hwan, who you probably know as Kobao, the famous newspaper cartoonist. And this is actually a beautiful watercolor painting. This is Kobao and his friends sitting around Uijeongbu on the first day of the war. There's a little village in the rice paddies, the bare hills, very few trees in Korea in those days. And these are the artillery explosions as the North Korean People's Army charge south. And of course, the North Korean People's Army is a very effective army. 2 divisions had fought with Mao Zedong in China. And this is what Kim Sung-hwan saw when they took Seoul 3 days later. It's a really good photograph, a really good painting. You've got this very tough looking North Korean officer just here. You've got, I don't know if you can see him, this very inexperienced young soldier here with very, very wide eyes, probably from the shock of combat when people get this kind of staring face. You've got this very effective Russian tank, the T-34, which the North Koreans had, but you've also got an old-fashioned cart pulled by a horse. So the North Korean People's Army is a mix of very, very tough soldiers and very young, inexperienced soldiers, very modern equipment, but also some very old-fashioned equipment. As you know, of course, America soon reacts. America joins the war within days, and American troops enter from Japan and are almost immediately in contact with the Korean People's Army. And to the surprise, to the shock of the Americans, they find these North Korean soldiers are highly effective fighters. And the Americans, together with the ROKs, are pushed down south through that summer of war towards the Pusan perimeter, when only Daegu and Pusan will remain within the South Korean perimeter. And the second group of UN troops to arrive would be British. This is these guys arriving in Pusan Harbour in August 1950. And these are Scottish soldiers from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Why is Britain involved in the Korean War? There's no one reason. Partly, Britain was a founding member of the UN. And of course, the Americans are going to fight this war under the war banner of the United Nations. Secondly, the Cold War is already getting very, very hot. British soldiers are fighting communist guerrillas in Malaya. We've recently finished fighting communist rebels in the Greek Civil War. And now this new war begins in Korea. So the British government, has to pay a debt to the Americans. The Americans helped us in World War II, but also the British government believes that there's a global communist plot for world domination. So as well as Greece, as well as Malaya, it's realized that Korea is the new front. So Britain sends a brigade, 3 battalions, each of 600 men from Hong Kong to fight in Korea. And I really like this photograph. This is one of the Scottish soldiers just after he got off the boat, and he looks a bit worried. And I think he's probably looking beyond Pusan to the mountains beyond Pusan, the Tebaksan range that heads up the peninsula, because mountains are bad for soldiers. In the army, they say mountains eat men. And of course, the mountains are good for the Korean army, the North Korean army, because they're tough infantry soldiers. They're not so good for the American army, who want to be in tanks and vehicles. So Korea is a bad country for the Americans to fight in. And as the British soldiers are put in a train to go north of Pusan to the Nakdong River, the Nakdong Gang, they pass through the Peace Market in Pusan. Again, thousands of refugees from Korea, northern parts of Korea, have come down following the UN forces, and many of them are struggling to survive. There's no NGOs in those days. There's no social welfare. And this is a tragic photograph of 2 Korean children living, probably lost their parents, living in the rubble of their country as war destroys Korea. But the British soldiers, they're soon out of Busan, and they immediately go into the front line on the Nakdong River. And again, this is the summer of 1950. You can see the guys here in a hilltop strongpoint. This is the Nakdong River here, and this is the hills on the north side of the Nakdong. And these hills are occupied by the North Korean army at this point of the war. What's happening is the North Koreans are forward deployed, and they're attacking the UN lines all across the Busan perimeter. So the British troops, the day they get off the boat, are already in action. This is a sniper team who've just returned from shooting at night on the river. And the fighting continues like this for about 2 weeks. And then the British troops are told, for the first time in this war, the UN forces are going to attack. We're no longer going to accept the North Koreans. We're going across the Nakdong River, and we're going to start pushing north. And this is mid-September 1950, aerial reconnaissance photo of the UN attack across the Nakdong. The British will attack with 2 battalions. First will be the Middlesex Battalion, who come from London. They attack their hill, they're successful. The 2nd Battalion, which crosses the river, will have a much more devastating experience in their first battle in Korea. So the Scottish soldiers advance up the hill, and they surprise the North Koreans. The North Koreans are having their breakfast, eating rice, and they overrun their position at close range. And then they consolidate on the top of the hill, just south of Songju. This is a photograph taken that morning. This is the Argylls sitting down in their positions. They've pushed away the North Koreans. Everything looks good. But the North Koreans are actually very good soldiers. And as the morning wears on, the North Koreans start attacking. There's not many trees, but there's low brush. And the North Koreans are crawling through the brush and starting to shoot. And the British are starting to lose men. And the balance of the battle turns against the Scottish soldiers. There are now more North Koreans on the mountain than Scottish. And this is, again, a very, very good photograph. This is Lieutenant Jock Eddington. He's just been shot in the thigh, so his artery has been severed. He's dying, he's bleeding out. He's being carried down the mountain, and you can see, look at the faces of these guys, and look at their torn uniforms, and look at their weapons. They've got the bayonet, which is the knife, is fixed to their rifle. And this tells you something about Korean War fighting. It's close range, it's traumatic, and because you're fighting on mountains, if one man is hit, it takes 4 people to carry him away. So it's a bad situation. The Scottish soldiers are now in big trouble. They're being attacked by 2 sides from the North Koreans. So they get on the radio, they call in an American airstrike. And the Americans are armed with an absolutely horrible bomb. It's made of a combination of naphtha and palm oil. Naphtha is an incendiary, a burning device. Palm oil is a kind of a sticky substance. It's put together and it's called napalm. And this stuff will burn at 800 degrees, 8 times hotter than boiling water, and it sticks to anything it touches, and it creates the most horrible burns. Unlike an explosion from a bomb that bursts upwards, napalm will roll downwards. It's like halasan, like the lava coming down. So it's very difficult to escape it. And this stuff, when it's dropped, you can see it here being dropped on a Korean village, is a really nasty weapon. The journalists in Korea called it the hell bomb. And that's exactly what is dropped on top of the Argylls on Hill 288. Unfortunately, the Americans make a terrible mistake. Instead of dropping it on the North Koreans, they drop it on the Scottish soldiers. 70 men just incinerated within about 2 or 3 seconds. The men who were there and saw the injuries were horrified. One man was smoking a cigarette, and when he took the cigarette, his mouth came away on the cigarette. A really bad situation. So suddenly the battle has changed drastically. The North Koreans now see their chance and attack immediately en masse. The top of the hill is covered in burning Scottish soldiers. If they're not evacuated, the North Koreans will kill them. At this stage of the war, no prisoners are being taken. One man in the Scottish battalion, Major Kenny Moore, runs forward with a submachine gun with just 12 men and says, "Everybody follow me." And he runs up. This is a painting, no photographs were taken, and starts holding back the North Koreans. This is the attacking North Koreans. This is Kenny Muir, and this is his 12 soldiers holding off about 700 men. And the men who were on the hill with Muir said, you know, this guy was running up and down. There were bullets flying around with him. He was a dynamo. Behind him, the men are frantically moving the wounded off the mountain, getting them out of the way. And the North Koreans are being held off. Inevitably, Kenny Muir is shot dead, but his body is dragged off the mountain. The North Koreans recapture the mountain. So for the Scottish soldiers, the first battle in Korea has been a disaster. They've been bombed by the Americans, pushed off the mountain by the North Koreans, but Kenny Muir becomes the first VC, Victoria Cross of the Korean War. The Victoria Cross is the highest decoration for bravery that the British government can give. And of course, he is given it as a dead man. It's a posthumous award. So to this day, Kenny Muir, his name is known in the Scottish regiments of the British Army for what he did that day in 1950. The next morning, the Argylls have to attack again to retake the hill. So they charge up, and to their surprise, the North Koreans have disappeared. So the UN forces move forward. The villages are empty. Many, of course, are completely destroyed. And this is a classic Korean War image. A ruined village, a young girl, possibly with her brother or sister on back, just waiting for someone to help them because they've lost their parents. And some of the Scottish soldiers are saying, you know, are we fighting the right war? You know, this village has been destroyed by UN air power. Are we helping these people or are we destroying them? War is a very destructive business. But the North Koreans have disappeared, and the guys can't understand it. Why have they retreated? What they don't know is that 2 days before, September the 15th, at Incheon, the Americans had landed in the most famous amphibious attack of the Korean War. So while all the fighting is taking place sort of, if this is Korea, around the Busan perimeter, MacArthur has sailed around the peninsula and landed behind the North Korean. So the North Koreans are now cut off from Busan and from Incheon, and the UN forces are trying to crush them in 2 pincers. MacArthur is delighted. His Incheon landing has been completely successful. And this is, again, a superb photograph which tells you a lot about the Korean War fighting. This was taken in the Shincheon area of Seoul about 2 days after the Incheon landing. Take a look. So what you're looking at is this man is turning back. This is an American Marine, 2 more American Marines, and just in this hole in the ground is a North Korean soldier. So these guys have shot him, and the cameraman turned around and captured the picture literally when the bullets were hitting the North Korean. And you can see the fighting range. It's about 5 meters. In World War II, the fighting range is about 150 to 200 meters. In the Korean War, the nature of the war is very, very close. It's very, very traumatic, unpleasant fighting. But the North Koreans now are in big trouble. They're being pushed back from Seoul, pushed back from Busan. This was a painting Kobo did in Myeongdong, you can see the church, and these are some North Korean soldiers. And what they've done is they've taken off their uniforms and they're wearing the white peasant uniform so they can escape into the hills. And this, of course, becomes another problem in the Korean War, because now the UN soldiers, they can't tell, is this man a soldier or is he a civilian? And this explains many of the killings that take place, like at Nogunri. And now we have this very sort of strange interregnum in the Korean War. South Korea has been liberated. The North Koreans have retreated north. What's going to happen next? In October, a decision is made by the Americans. The British present a resolution in the United Nations. The UN forces will continue to advance, will liberate all of North Korea. Elections will be held, and the Korean Peninsula will be unified under the UN flag. And this, of course, is a famous photograph as the UN forces drive across the old 38th parallel into North Korea. And of course, nobody knows that this is a march into disaster. This is a hinge point of 20th century history. But at first, things are going well. The UN forces are advancing north towards Pyongyang. Again, this is again shows the problems that the North Korean villagers face. The North Koreans are leaving behind snipers, just one or two people to shoot from the villages. And of course, the UN forces will use massive firepower. So the villages are being burned down as the fighting moves north. And this is a very famous photograph, a tragic photograph, which was taken just south of Sariwon in October 1950 by an American photographer. And this is a family, a woman and two young children were hiding in a ditch, and the British soldiers were walking past. They made a move. One of the British soldiers turned, fired, and killed the mother. A mistake of war. Many people say that's a photograph of a North Korean atrocity. Actually, it's a photograph of a British mistake. So again, the tragedy for the North Korean people mounts, and the babies are removed from their mother and taken south and handed over to the Red Cross. What happened to those children is a mystery. Who knows? But the North Korean army seems to have been defeated. This is the Australians have now joined the British Brigade. This is the 3rd Royal Australian Regiment. Very, very tough fighters. As you can see, some North Korean civilians are bowing to them. The Australians rob a North Korean bank as they're going through a village, and as they're driving through the towns, are throwing out all the money. And these are the North Korean civilians, you know, picking up the money. So it's almost like a carnival atmosphere. The war seems to be over. The North Koreans are running. This is again the Scottish soldiers attacking towards North Korean positions in Sariwon. They would overrun the positions, and Sariwon is the gateway towards Pyongyang. And this is one of the strangest battles of the Korean War. If you had this in a movie, people couldn't believe it. So what happens that night in Sariwon is the British and Australians drive into the city. As you can see, so they're driving from south to north through the streets of Sariwon. But as it's nearly darkness, the orders are, don't stay the night in the town. We want you to turn around and come south. We'll wait outside the town tonight and we'll retake it in daylight. And so darkness is falling. This is the Scottish soldiers moving south through Sariwon. They said there was a very strange feeling. And as we're walking down the main street, it's getting dark. We saw a line of soldiers walking towards us. And they walked past us, and we looked at them, and they looked at us. I said, who are these guys? They're Asian soldiers. Are they South Koreans? And this is the width of a road. They're about 5 meters apart. The British column going this way, and the other column coming the other way, and then North Koreans about 1,200 North Koreans are now marching north to escape. About 600 British are marching south, and they're literally walking past each other. And so the British are just saying, there's too many of them. We can't fight. Everybody just shh. And the funny thing is, if you look at the British uniform, the hat, the jacket, and the weapons, they look like Russians. We don't look like Americans. And so one of the North Koreans shouts across the road, "Da, tovarish," because the North Koreans think the Russians are now coming down from the north to save them. And so you have this bizarre situation that lasts 10 or 20 minutes until suddenly at the back of the column, a North Korean looks very closely at a British soldier. The British soldier looks at the North Korean, and suddenly complete mayhem. Close range battle breaks out across the street of Sariwon. The British soldiers dive into the ditch at the side of the road and are firing their machine guns. The North Koreans are running like hell to escape into the north. The end result is the biggest number of prisoners taken in the entire Korean War so far. So the Battle of Sariwon, a bizarre fight, but a great success for the British and Australians. After Sariwon is taken, ROK 1st Division under the famous General Baek Sun-yup takes Pyongyang, which is his hometown. Baek Sun-yup knows exactly where to cross the Dedong-gang because he used to go swimming in the Dedong-gang when he was a young man. So the South Koreans retake Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung gives an order to his soldiers, fight to the last drop of blood, but he runs to Kanghae on the China border and hides. The advance continues beyond Pyongyang. The British are now leading the way, and the Australians, again, to show you some of the horror of war. This is a North Korean soldier who was shot by one of the Australian snipers. Again, you can see very, very, very close range. And again, many of the North Korean soldiers now, they don't have uniforms. They're dressed as civilians. This is a North Korean soldier who was killed when his own hand grenade exploded in his right hand and blew off his right hand and right leg. So this is the horror of war. But as the British and Australian troops advance through North Korea, the fighting dies down. It's now October, late October. It's starting to get cold. The winter clouds are coming in from Manchuria. And as they advance through the ruins of North Korea, they get this strange feeling. And the photograph I'm going to show you next was taken on Halloween 1950. Halloween for British and Americans is the night of ghosts, the night of the dead. It's a scary night, the night when the ghosts and the witches come out. And the British soldiers are now deep in North Korea. All the civilians have disappeared. The houses are empty. There's a strange feeling that something really, really bad is going to happen, but no one knows what. This photograph was taken just before dark on Halloween 1951. This is outside the town of Chungju. These are Scottish soldiers in the ruins, in a defensive position, digging in for the night, waiting to see what will happen. This guy here, the young officer, 2 days after this photograph was taken, would be in a jeep racing towards Pyongyang. One of his legs had been blown off. One of his legs was shot through. And he said, I will never forget that strange night. We all knew something bad was going to happen, but we didn't know what it was. Of course, what it is a new opponent has entered the war. The North Koreans have been defeated, but across the Yalu River, tens, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops are now crossing the Amnok-gang as winter falls on the Korean peninsula. And these are good soldiers. They normally march at night. This is an unusual photograph. They each have a little sort of umbrella frame, and they put leaves in it. And as they're marching, they'll hold this umbrella So the UN aircraft flying above can't see them. So these Chinese soldiers are tough. They're used to living in very tough conditions. They're used to eating bad food. They're used to fighting at night in the countryside. They're not used to flying aeroplanes or driving tanks. They're very tough soldiers, and they've got a brilliant, brilliant tactic. It's called human wave. And to understand how China crushes the UN in North Korea, you have to understand this tactic. So imagine my fist is a UN American or British or South Korean unit. They're on a hill or maybe in a village. What the Chinese will do is after dark at nightfall, they will advance close to the position, and after dark, they will attack in mass, trying to overrun the position. But at the same time, other Chinese units will be going round the side and making blocking units behind this UN position. So this is a road, this is a hill, and when the UN try to get their wounded men out or try to get resupplies up, the Chinese will ambush them from behind. So they get cut off and surrounded. It's called human wave. It comes from Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese military philosopher, who says your attack should be like water. It goes over the rock or around the rock. And this is the simple but brilliant tactic the Chinese will use. And for the British, what happens now will be a terrifying situation in the town of Pakchon in North Korea. Suddenly, the guys in the valleys below will look up on the hillsides, and they could see it looks like the hillside is moving because the Chinese have got camouflage in their hats, and it literally looks like a marching forest. Another guy told me I was sitting on a hilltop looking into the north, and the hill in front of me started changing color. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. I didn't have binoculars. So I looked really, really hard, and I was absolutely terrified. I realized it was thousands of men ahead of me running down this hill, and the surface of the hill was moving. So the British in Pakchon are now seeing the Chinese getting around behind them, and they've got to fight their way down the road to the south before the Chinese can cut the road behind them. This is one of the Australians who's just been shot in the leg, is being treated at the battle in the afternoon. And he says, I knew we had to get out. I had to get on a jeep. Again, this is the guys fighting a running battle. They're firing a small mortar into the hills to keep the Chinese heads down while they get out to the south. And this again is British troops behind a tank. The Chinese are in the hill up here. The guys are taking cover behind a tank. The tank is shooting up, and you can see it's got a white cloth on the back. That's air recognition for the UN aircraft. Don't shoot us. So in Pakchon, you have this running fight. And the brigade managed to break out. They get south of the Chongchong River and blow the bridges. It's now not clear what's going to happen in the Korean War. The UN forces have been absolutely shocked by this sudden Chinese offensive. But MacArthur doesn't believe the Chinese have staying power. He decides to launch a final attack towards the Amnok-gang, towards the Yalu, to push the Chinese out and finish the war. And he's making a terrible mistake. The Chinese have disappeared, but they haven't left Korea. They've just gone deep into the mountains, into deep cover. More Chinese have crossed the Amnok-gang. They're building up forces, and they're waiting for the UN to advance. Then they can envelop them in a giant human wave. This is the biggest ambush of the 20th century. The Americans lead the attack because they've got the armored vehicles. They are walking literally into the mouth of hell. As they drive up the roads, they're ambushed from both sides by the Chinese. Their communications are cut off, and the Americans are now in complete control. The British don't have vehicles, so the British are ordered march north to try and break out the second American Infantry Division, 2ID, which to this day is still based here in South Korea, because 2nd Infantry Division is now surrounded by Chinese. So again, the British troops and the Australians start marching north towards a place in North Korea called Kunu-ri, which every American soldier will remember with horror. It's the worst American disaster of the modern age. And as the British soldiers are marching, they get the Scottish bagpipes at the front. You know, this Scottish instrument? This is a photograph. So they're playing this music as they march through the countryside. And the guy said, we saw very strange sights, complete silence. There was nobody around. We came to a train, on a train line. All the doors were open. The train was completely empty. We don't know what happened to the people. Very spooky. We came to an American artillery position with the guns firing 360 degrees all around. And we kept moving north. We marched through the day, and at night we couldn't stop. Keep marching, keep heading north to Kunu-ri. And as they march through the night, they're playing these bagpipes, this strange Scottish instrument. And one of the guys years later said, I'll never forget that night march. We were playing the bagpipes. We knew we were in terrible danger. We could feel the enemy was all around us. We had this strange feeling that the Scottish soldiers from 10 years or hundreds of years before, their ghosts were guiding us through to safety. And indeed, the British were not attacked that night. But the next morning, they're told, take up a position south of Kunu-ri, because the Americans are going to come down the road through you. What the Americans don't know is the Chinese have set up a 4-mile ambush behind them. So as the Americans start driving south to meet the British, they're driving through a 4-mile hellfire, the gauntlet, a pass of absolute horror for the Americans. The Americans are driving down. The Chinese have set up 40 machine guns, 40 automatic weapons. So as the trucks go by, they're being literally shredded by fire. And the British, they start seeing these trucks come through. The wheels have been shot away. And men said it was like an old naval battle from the 19th century when the wooden ships have been shot and blood is pouring down the side of the hull. And this, of course, is the disaster for the Americans at 2ID. 6 battalions, about 2,000 men are wiped out. And this is the greatest Chinese victory of the Korean War. This is a famous photograph in the Dandong War Museum. You can see Chinese soldiers running past the wreckage of these shot up American trucks. So Kunu-ri is a disaster. And after that, the American army in North Korea disintegrates. The 8th Army falls apart. And this becomes one of the most shameful feats in modern American military history. To this day, it's called the big bug out, the big runaway. Units stop fighting, jump into their vehicles, and just head south. Let's get out of here. Let's get back to South Korea. And of course, as this is happening, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of North Korean citizens follow the UN forces, and it's now winter. And so this is a tragic photograph. This is a Korean family. You can see them, women and children by the side of the road. The vehicles, the Americans are driving past them. What happened here was this family, they said, help us. So they put all their things on the truck. But then the truck was ordered, go, go, go. And so that it left and just left the family with nothing. What happened to those people? Who knows? Disaster. And this is a classic Korean War image of a tiny young girl, probably only 5 or 6, in her winter clothes, abandoned and heading south. 700,000 Koreans are leaving North Korea. This is, again, a very famous photograph of North Koreans trying to escape across the Taedonggang Bridge, and it's freezing cold. Anyone who falls into that water will probably die of hypothermia. And of course, what is happening is not only do they want to escape the communists, who will come back with revenge against anybody who cooperated with the UN forces, the UN command are destroying everything behind them. Villages, schools, bridges are being blown up to slow down the Chinese. So this is called a scorched earth campaign. Everything behind you is burned and destroyed. And in this disaster, the British are the rear guard. They're the last unit who will come south. And this is the most dangerous position in any retreat, because you're the last guys to come through. And this is a photograph of the Australians pulling south. They're the last unit in the UN command, retreating through the devastation of North Korea in winter 1950. Come December, most of the UN forces have left North Korea. They're south of the parallel. And one of the British officers was in Seoul Station rallying his troops. And he said, I saw the last train coming down from Pyongyang. After that, the railway was cut. This is a train. And of course, you can see it's loaded with refugees. Thousands of people have tied themselves to the train. They're hanging on outside the train. And of course, Seoul to Pyongyang is an hours-long trip. It's freezing cold. And the officer said, I can never forget the sight. When the train arrived in Seoul Station, it was just a train with dead people hanging off it. They'd died of hypothermia. So a horrific situation. The UN command have been badly defeated. North Korea has been lost. Kim Il-sung has been saved by Mao Zedong. And China, this country which the world thought was a broken country, has suddenly stood up in global history and has defeated a major Western army in North Korea. So what will happen next? The British soldiers go into winter quarters in Uijeongbu. Uijeongbu at this time is just a ruined village. And they don't have a party at Christmas. They have a party at New Year. Here's a photograph from New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1950. These are the guys. They've got beer and they've got whiskey, which has been sent in from Japan. They're in Uijeongbu. No one knows what's going to happen next. Is there going to be a negotiation to end the Korean War? So they're all a bit drunk. They're having a good time, even amid the ruins. And just after midnight, they hear thunder coming from the north. There's and then they see flashes on the hillsides. This isn't thunder. In the very, very early hours of New Year's Day, the Chinese launch 168,000 soldiers across the Imjin River. This is the Chinese offensive. They've taken North Korea. Now they're invading South Korea. And once again, the UN forces are going to be very, very badly pushed back towards Seoul. And this will be the first or second major British disaster of the Korean War. Okay. A couple of years ago, I was doing some research on the Kim Shin-jo raid. I interviewed Kim Shin-jo about 5 years ago, and I managed to track down one of Park Chung-hee's bodyguards who was in the Blue House during the day of that raid. A very interesting guy. He said that, you know, Park Chung-hee, they had advanced intelligence that the North Koreans were coming down. So Park had actually escaped from the Blue House. Apparently there are tunnels underneath the Blue House as an escape, and he used one of these. So when Kim Shin-jo and his, you know, and his team came down, it was walking into an ambush, and you know they Park wasn't even there.
I think it's quite sad to hear your story. This is
I mean,
desperate situation.
Right, exactly.
All the people, they can expect anything at the time. They are just facing in danger. Right in front of the eyes.
Horrific experience for the Korean people.
We cannot imagine anything from now on. We just listen your story, then cannot imagine what happened.
Yeah, a lot of young Koreans say to me when I talk to them, I didn't realize how horrible the Korean War was, and it was a really, really nasty war for every reason.
Okay. 그 질문 혹시 하실 분들 있으시면 질문 준비하셨다가 수업 이제 10분 전에 질문을 모아서 이렇게 드리는 걸로 할게요. 혹시 질문 있으신 분은 이렇게 준비를 해주시면 이따 8시 50분 그때 한 10분 정도 질문 이렇게 서로 주고받고 하도록 하겠습니다. I just wonder how many years to interview for the older soldiers, British soldiers and Scottish soldiers.
4 or 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah, I did about 300 interviews.
Wow. So did you visit all of them in the UK?
I visited, I don't know, probably 50 or 100 of them in and around the UK. A lot of telephone interviews with guys in the US, in Belgium, in Australia, but also in the Imperial War Museum, which is the big, military museum in London. They have a very, very, very good recording archive of hundreds of interviews, actually thousands of interviews since I think about 1920. So all the different wars Britain's fought in, they've got some recordings, which are a really good resource for historians.
Okay, so I think so we can start now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we return to the grim days of the Chinese New Year's Day offensive in 1951, let me just introduce the guys I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation. So the original British unit that came to Korea from Hong Kong, which fought in North Korea, was 27th Brigade. But in late November, 29th Brigade arrives in Korea. And this is a much bigger and more powerful British unit. And they've come all the way from the UK. Now, a brigade is 3 battalions. A battalion is about 600 men. And 29th Brigade is commanded by this guy, General Tom Brodie. As you can see, a very soldierly looking guy. He had fought during World War II in Burma against the Japanese, so was very used to Asian warfare. But he was a very, very aggressive general. He was the kind of guy who liked to push forward, not pull back. And I think this personality trait gives us a clue to the tragedy that would take place in April 1951. Now, he had 3 infantry battalions under his command, all from different parts of the UK. From Northern England were the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers. That's the name of the battalion. They're from Northumberland, it's in northeast England, and they're commanded by this guy whose name is Kingsley Foster. And he was one of those kind of colonels who's almost like a father to his men. He had about 600 men in his battalion. He knew everybody's names. And a very good Korean friend of mine, his father was his interpreter. And he said that there were about 30 Koreans attached to the British unit to help them carry their gear, the Korean porters, the A-frame carriers. And a lot of these guys were badly treated by the UN units. But this guy, Kingsley Foster, was a real old school gentleman. And when the Koreans arrived at his unit, he gave them a speech and said, "Welcome to my battalion. We're going to fight a great war together," and shook their hands. And the next day, these older Korean porters were so impressed. They said, "Colonel Kingsley Foster, we want to tell you that if you ever run for president of South Korea, we'll all vote for you." He was that kind of guy, a really nice guy leading the Northumberland Fusiliers. Second battalion in the brigade was the Gloucester Battalion, the glorious Gloucesters, led by this guy, Colonel James Kahn. Again, he had fought in World War II against the Japanese, also in Burma, so was also familiar with Asian warfare. And again, he was an interesting guy. His men said, we really trusted Kahn, we would follow him anywhere, but he was a very, very quiet man. He barely spoke. And again, this may be part of the tragedy that would take place on the Imjin River. The 3rd Battalion of 600 men in the brigade were the Royal Ulster Rifles, pictured here. And they're from Ulster in Northern Ireland, but also a lot of Southern Irish people. So Irish guys serving in the British Army. As you probably know, Irish, very, very tough, like fighting. So they're a very, very aggressive battalion. So these are the 3 main units. There's also artillery, you know, field guns. There's engineers, the guys who build things and blow things up on the battlefield. There's also a tank regiment, the 8th Irish Hussars in their Centurion tanks. They're also attached to the brigade. So a very strong force. And it's this brigade, 29th Brigade, that is told to go forward on the afternoon of January the 3rd, 1951. The Chinese have attacked across the Imjin River. The American and the South Korean forces are retreating. The British are told, move forward to the town of Koyang, northwest of Seoul, close to what is now Ilsan, and hold open the road which leads from Koyang into northwest Seoul down towards Kupabal, a key road junction leading into Seoul. And their order is set up position on the hills and hold it against the Chinese. And this will be their first battle in Korea. And one of the Royal Ulster Rifles said, you know, it's freezing cold in that morning. We didn't know what was going to happen next. And we were looking down into the valley. We couldn't see anything. It was completely black and just snow. And one of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers said, I was in my trench with my rifle. I was in front of my battalion. My battalion was in front of the brigade. The brigade was in front of the UN command. I was the forwardmost guy in the UN forces in that morning of January the 3rd, 1950. And the battle started for me. It was just getting light and I could see these snowy mountains in front of me. And someone stood up right in front of me. It was a Chinese reconnaissance soldier who had crawled up to his position at night. And he was so close to me, my rifle barrel was touching his chest. So I pulled the trigger, bang, the guy was shot and fell on top of me with blood pouring out of his mouth. I pushed him off, and as I looked down the hill, I just saw hundreds of men running up at me. So bang, this is battle on again. This is the Chinese human wave attacking up the hill in a dawn attack. And to make these attacks more frightening, the Chinese don't have radios. So to signal their different units, they use bugles. And so, again, this is a Chinese bugler as his men go into the attack. You can see he's playing it here. So this is really scary. Firstly, a Chinese bugle makes a strange sound in the night. And of course, when you hear that, you know, here they come. So it's a psychological weapon. Anyway, all day, 29th Brigade fight. And they're pushing the Chinese back and they stop the attack all that day. They're holding Koyang. They've got a lot of UN air support coming in. They've got tanks shooting at the Chinese, and the Chinese are stopped dead. So the 29th Brigade are delighted. We finally stopped the Chinese. You know, this is looking good. What they don't know is that the rest of the front has crumbled, and the UN are going to pull out of Seoul and abandon Seoul to the enemy. So as darkness falls that night, 29th Brigade are told, we've got to move south really fast, get on the trucks, go through Seoul, get across the Han River Bridge, get out as fast as you can. Again, you're the last unit coming south. Then we're going to blow up the bridges and leave Seoul. So this is a really dangerous, really scary situation. Retreating while you're in contact with the enemy is the most dangerous operation in war. So the battalions pull out. The last battalion to move is the Royal Ulster Rifles, and they're going to pull off at night down this valley, a place called Chaganhyun in Koyang. As you can see, this is a vehicle, there's a frozen riverbed, and these are the hills. And so the Irish soldiers will pull off the hills and march quietly down this riverbed with the tanks coming up at the back. It's nighttime. They're told no speaking, no talking. This is a silent night retreat, because as soon as we pull off these hills, the Chinese can come on the hills and shoot down on us. So we have to be completely silent. But things begin quite well. This long snake of men are moving. People are whispering on the radios. The vehicles are moving with their engines silenced. And then a terrible mistake. An American aircraft flying above drops a line of flares, you know, like fireworks, and it lights up the whole stream bed with these 600 men marching down. So everybody freezes. They look up. Terrible disaster. The officer saying, "Get that aeroplane away from us. Get that plane out of here." And then slowly, the flares go out. Darkness falls. Now nobody can see. Their night vision's gone. Everybody sort of holds their breath. You know, maybe the Chinese didn't see us. And then suddenly, from the hilltop, a machine gun starts firing. Then another. Then the mortars start firing. Then as they look up, the sky is lit up with flares. Hundreds of men come running down the hillsides. And suddenly it's literally hand-to-hand fighting, the worst kind of combat, as the Chinese are grabbing the British soldiers, and this kilometer-long line of men is just a big fight. At the end of the stream is a small Korean village. The Chinese set fire to the village, so everything is illuminated. So you've got this white snowfield, blackness above, a burning village. The commander, the colonel of the Royal Ulster Rifles, fixes his bayonet and says, "We have to break through the village. Follow me." He goes into the village. There's a melee in the village. He's never seen again. He's killed in action. There are 10 tanks in the valley floor. Every single tank is destroyed by the Chinese at close range, ramming bombs into the tracks. Absolute disaster. So this becomes a mile-long running battle. And along the stream bed, this is what it looks like today. There's a railway bridge. And the Chinese set up a machine gun under the railway bridge. One of the young officers says, "We have to fight past this machine gun." He personally attacks it, destroys the machine gun, and the other guys can escape downriver. Obviously, it was snowy and frozen over that night. And if you go to that area today, you can still see in the concrete the bullet holes from that night of battle 70 years ago today. The Ulster Rifles Battalion, in one night of combat, out of 600 men, lose 159 men, including their commanding officer. And this was a photograph taken later of one of their tanks lost in the valleys, in the valley. The villagers there, some of the old ones, still remember that day. They said the next morning these tanks were smoking and their engines were going, but their crews were dead. And one by one, as they ran out of fuel, the tanks would just drop silent. And they said there was, at the entrance to the valley where the Ulster Rifles had escaped, there was a ring of soldiers in 360-degree defense with their weapons in their hands that they'd died fighting in this retreat to Seoul. And of course, the men thought it was an absolute disaster. You know, we're pulling out of Seoul. They go through Seoul. Seoul is on fire. They go across the Han River Bridge in trucks. Behind them, they can see explosions as everything is blown up behind them. And this is the worst day in the history of South Korea, the January the 4th retreat. Seoul has been abandoned to the Chinese. UN forces have been defeated again. And again, many of the Royal Ulster Rifle soldiers said, our fight on the 3rd and 4th of January was for nothing. We gave up Seoul. But I was told by a Korean historian, no, you saved thousands of lives, because by holding the Chinese for one day, you let thousands of South Koreans cross the Han River on January the 4th. And this is later in the year. This is the cross which was set up to commemorate the dead of the Royal Ulster Rifles in that valley. It's now called the Battle of Happy Valley, because of course it wasn't happy. And this stone memorial, made of Korean stone, has now been moved and is outside Belfast City Hall as a Korean War memorial. But Seoul is lost. This is the engineers blowing the bridges over the Han River. The Chinese are winning once again. So we now have this winter of fighting south of Seoul, attacks on hilltop positions, mountain warfare, fighting in the hills in the southeast, freezing cold weather. But now it's the Chinese who are at the end of their long supply line. Many of them have got typhoid or typhus. They don't have a lot of ammunition. They don't have a lot of food. And the UN forces are starting to push back. They're using firepower against the Chinese manpower. So you get offensives like Operation Ripper, Operation Killer, which are designed to kill as many Chinese as possible. This is the Gloucesters after taking Hilltop, Hill 355, and you can see how smashed up it is. They've taken it from a Chinese battalion, and it's completely destroyed and devastated by UN artillery. By March, the Chinese, facing this firepower, have pulled back, and UN forces are now closing in on Seoul. And this is a British tank firing from Yeongdongpo across the Han River at a North Korean tank in Seoul. What they don't realize is it's not a North Korean tank, it's actually a British tank which was captured by the Chinese in Happy Valley, and they used it for their own purposes. So the British destroyed their own tank at a 2,000-meter shot, which was at the time a world record. But the Chinese don't fight for Seoul, they leave it. And the UN forces retake Seoul, and of course much of downtown now is ruined. Very few people have remained in Seoul. It's diseased. It's a really bad place. But finally, of course, spring has come to Korea. The Chinese are pulling back into the north. Where they're going, nobody knows. What their intentions are, nobody knows. And for the first time in the Korean War, there's this strange stop in the action. It's now April. That terrible winter of war has finished, and 29th Brigade is ordered to move up and take a forward position on the Imjin River. And as you know, the Imjin River is directly north of Seoul. The Imjin Valley is the last defensive position before the Han River Valley. So the brigade move into positions on the Imjin River. And again, the weather is beautiful. A lot of the guys remember we were relaxed. There were no Chinese around. The countryside was coming back to life. We'd patrol through the villages. The South Koreans were very friendly. We'd give cigarettes and chocolate to them. They'd give us fresh vegetables. And one of the guys remembers you'd wake up in the morning on your hilltop, and the Imjin River would be that sea of mist below you. And from the villages, you'd see the fires from the Korean villages, the chimney fires coming up through the mist. He says it was a really dreamlike landscape. I'll never forget the beauty of the Imjin River Valley in early 1951. But the war is not over, of course. So the brigade now are moving north of the Imjin River on long patrols, just going 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers, looking for the Chinese, and they find nothing. The Chinese, this kind of ghost army, has disappeared once again. What nobody in the UN knows is that Marshal Peng Du-hwai, the commander-in-chief appointed by Mao, is now preparing his biggest single attack of the Korean War. He's got about 300,000 men, a third of a million men. including fresh divisions from China. What his battle plan is, on the night of 22nd of April, strike north along a 40-mile front along the Hantan and Imjin rivers. He wants to break through behind the main UN line in the Imjingang Valley and the Kapyong Valley, get behind the UN forces, destroy all the American forces. He's going to get behind them, destroy them. America's out of the war, and then he'll take Seoul by May Day as a gift to Mao Zedong. And this will be the end of the Korean War. Nobody knows this, but on 22nd of April is a Sunday. 29th Brigade are taking it easy. And this is, to me, the most tragic photograph of the Korean War. This was taken on that Sunday morning, April 22nd, 1951. Two very young British officers. One is 23, one is 21, in a little Confucian temple just south of the Imjin River. They'd had a church service there. It was empty. They thought, this is Korean holy ground. It's Sunday. So they'd prayed and they were taking it easy. They didn't know that after dark that night, at about 10 o'clock, the Chinese would cross the river in massive force. What makes this photograph so extraordinary is both these young men would win the highest decoration for gallantry, for bravery, and neither would live to tell the tale. Both were killed. But that morning, they had no idea what was going to happen after dark that night. So this is the Battle of April 1951, the biggest attack of the Korean War. That is Seoul, Uijeongbu. This is the Imjin River, and these lines are the Chinese attacks. This is Kapyong, this is Imjin. As you can probably see, the densest concentration of the Chinese attack is across the Imjin River. The Chinese want to cut the road to Uijeongbu so they can get behind the Americans up here. So this is the battle plan. What happens that night as darkness falls across the UN line? People start getting reports. We're seeing enemy movement, massive enemy movement heading south. As the sun goes down, air reconnaissance is reporting we're seeing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of enemy troops. They're heading south in massive force, prepare to receive an attack. In the sector of 29th Brigade, this is the Imjin River. The Gloucesters are positioned just here on the left flank. Here is the South Korean 1st Division. Seoul is down here. Tongjucheon is about here. So the Gloucesters are out here and they're in the curve of the Imjin. And as they receive these radio reports, they send a young lieutenant, a guy called Guy Temple. I want you to go down to the Imjin River with just 16 men. We think the Chinese will attack tonight, but they can't attack in mass. They'll probably send a small force across the river. So we want you to go down to the river and grab a prisoner so we can interrogate him, find out Chinese intentions. And Guy Temple said, one of my grandfathers was a general, one of my grandfathers was a bishop, and I had a strange sense. The Chinese weren't going to send a small force. They were going to send thousands of men. So I took as much ammunition down to the river that night as possible. Usually one man has 200 bullets. I told my men 2,000 bullets, 10 times more than usual. I had this bad feeling. So they went down to the riverbank, they dug in and they waited above the river looking. Guy said it was a beautiful night. There was a full moon. It was almost romantic. And I said, I'm going to get a sleep and I'm going to wake up at 10:30. Something may happen. So him and his 15 guys are waiting. And at 10:30, Guy snaps awake and the soldier next to him said, shh, there's a sound in the river. So Guy looks and it's completely black. He can't see anything. He said, we could hear voices in the river. We couldn't identify the language. So I quickly put up a flare, and this flare illuminates the river. And in the river was a sight like I've never seen in my life. The whole river in this circle of flare light was just crowded with men. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like people coming out of a market or coming out of a football stadium. And for a few seconds, this flare is burning above us. The Chinese look up at us, several hundred Chinese. The 16 British are looking down at them. And then suddenly the flare goes out, blackness, no one can see. The guy says, I remembered what I was there to do. So I shouted, open fire. And we all started pouring rapid fire into the river. And he remembers, I've got an artillery mission on call. So I called on the radio, the artillery, I've got enemy in the river, give me a mic target. A mic target means you're going to use every single gun, 24 artillery pieces, and all their shells will land at the same time. So we called this in, I said, everyone get your heads down. 24 shells come over their heads. He says it sounded like an express train. And then in the river, these yellow-white flashes, water splashing up, and everybody's shooting into the river. So complete and utter chaos. The shooting stops, complete silence. Again, they listen, voices in the river. Same thing happens. This goes on for 3 hours. He said at the end of it, the guy said, I saw something I'd never seen before in all my military career. We were shooting machine guns with so many bullets that the barrels of the guns were turning kind of peach color, pink. They were literally white hot at night. We were firing so much. But by about midnight, I called the artillery. I said, I've got targets in the river. The artillery says, sorry, everybody is in action. I've got no more guns for you. And at this point, guys, men, each had 2,000 rounds, but they're running out of ammunition. So he says, I had 16 men. I've got 1,000 or 2,000 Chinese coming across the river. What am I going to do? Everybody follow me. We just got off and we ran like hell to the first British hilltop position. And, this is one guy, 19 years old, with 15 men, holding about 14,000 Chinese for 3 hours on the riverbank. Of his men, none of them had a scratch. So a brilliant, brilliant piece of soldiering by Guy Temple. But of course, once the Chinese are across the Imjin River and they can deploy their mass in human wave, the British are going to be in big trouble. And this was a photograph taken after the battle of Chinese wreckage in the Imjin River. And you can still visit. I've swum in that water. Very, very shallow, very easy for the Chinese to cross. And again, that was a photograph taken during the daylight hours of the Chinese storming across the Imjin River. Meanwhile, the rest of the brigade are coming under attack. Again, the brigade are on hilltop positions. The Chinese are attacking. What's it like to be in this battle? I spoke to the guys. They said it's complete chaos. Above you, you've got all these flares and fireworks. Below you, you can't see the Chinese because they're on a hill. And then you hear them shouting, and then you see these white faces coming up at you. You're firing, and your bullets have green traces. The Chinese have red incoming. They're crisscrossing. Everybody's throwing hand grenades. And for every 2 British soldiers, there's about 16 or 17 Chinese soldiers. So really nasty, really frightening combat. One by one, the British positions are overrun. And this is when 2 young officers I saw you today were badly wounded or killed. The Royal Ulster Rifles, who have a reserve unit, cross the Imjin in their armored vehicles. They're ambushed on the other side of the Imjin River, completely destroyed. One of the survivors says, Jesus Christ, 50 of us had run into an entire army. All our vehicles are destroyed. This is a photograph taken after the battle of the smashed up vehicles of the Ulster Rifles across the Imjin. As the infantry are pushed back from the hill, the artillery, the guns, come under direct attack. This is the artillery officer, George Truell, The Chinese are coming down the hill. The artillery, instead of firing up and over, have to fire direct fire. So this is a tactic from 19th century battlefields, from Napoleonic warfare, firing directly at the enemy at about 200 yards range. Really frightening stuff. This is the battlescape. As daylight breaks, the UN air power can come online. This is an amazing photograph taken from the turret of a British tank. One US aircraft has gone. It's dropped its napalm here and here. This is a Chinese occupied hill. So what happens in this battle is the Chinese will attack at night, and then during the day they'll go undercover because they don't want to face the UN air power. Then they'll attack again at night. And so the British during the day are regrouping, trying to evacuate their wounded. But of course, by the first morning of battle, their ambulances can't get out. The Chinese are behind them. So the Gloucesters especially have been completely cut off and are now surrounded by the Chinese. Battle continues for 2 more nights. And again, but across the entire UN front, this attack is so massive that the UN command decides we can't hold any longer. What we've got to do is we're going to get into our vehicles. We're going to head about 12 miles south, establish another line north of sort of Uijeongbu, and that'll give us time and give us a day's break because the Chinese don't have vehicles. They'll have to follow us. So this may seem like a good idea, but again, remember, for a unit that's in contact with the enemy, trying to break out and withdraw is a really, really dangerous operation. And the breakout order will be given on the morning of April 25th, 1951. So far, the British have managed to hold the Imjin River, but what will happen now will be a bloodbath. And this again is an extraordinary photograph taken that morning on April 25th. You can see that the mist in the Imjin Valley is starting to lift. The British troops have been told, come down from your hills. We're going to march down the valley, head south, get in American trucks, and then get the hell out. But of course, as soon as the British come off these hills, the Chinese are going to get on the hills and can shoot down. And Johnny Shaw, this officer here, is a major. He was the second in command of the Ulster Rifles. He said to the photographer, Mervyn McCord, Mervyn, take my photograph and give it to Marion, my wife. So McCord said, okay, took the photograph. He had a Leica camera he'd bought in Japan. And he says, I knew Johnny Shaw realized he was going to die. He knew how dangerous the situation was. And about 15 or 20 minutes after this photograph was taken, Johnny Shaw was killed in battle. Because what happens, of course, is as the British pull off their hilltop positions, it's broad daylight. The Chinese can see everything, and the Chinese on the top of the hilltop start appearing. One of the tank commanders said, as we were pulling out, everyone was marching down the valley floor, getting in jeeps, getting in trucks. I looked up at the hilltops, and across the hill, which we had abandoned, I could see 1, 2, 3, 4, just people standing up on the hill. 10, 20, then hundreds, then thousands, silhouetted on the hilltop. And then they all come running down the hill and they're among us. And again, it's this hand-to-hand fight with the Chinese swamping the British. And this is, no photographs were taken. This was a disastrous combat. But this is a famous painting of that morning. The Royal Ulster Rifles, they're firing their mortars to try and cover the guys. The trucks are heading down south. The Chinese are running down here, and the armored vehicles and tanks are shooting behind them. It's at this point that Kingsley Foster, the colonel of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, who shouldn't be on the battlefield, he should be in the rear with the radios, but he always wanted to be up front with his men. He drove up in his jeep and said to a unit, give me your wounded men, put your wounded men in the jeep, loaded up. The officer said, "Sir, don't drive down the track. The Chinese are behind us." He said, "We've got no choice. I've got to go." Drove his jeep down the track. Chinese machine gun fires. He was killed. One of his men said, "I ran past his body. He was lying face down on the track." And he was a man, like I said, who knew the names of every single person in his battalion. The British tanks are now fighting to cover the retreat, and the Chinese are literally running on top of the tanks. So one of the tanks drives through a Korean house to get rid of the Chinese. Another tank literally fires its machine gun at the tank to spray the Chinese off. And meanwhile, the Chinese, thousands of Chinese, are on the valley floor, and the tanks are literally driving through and over the Chinese and the British. So they've got bits of human bodies in their suspension, and literally just blood and limbs. You know, a horrific sight. Again, the Chinese human wave has been very successful. This photograph was taken after the battle. You can see the road the British were retreating down. There's a little trees here, and the Chinese had put anti-tank guns in these trees. So as the British are going down the road, they have to slow down at this bend, and the Chinese could take out the tanks and the ambulances. So the last tanks saw what was going on, decided get off the road, and drove around the copse. And you can see the tracks from when they drove around the Chinese ambush and escaped. And this again was a photograph taken at the end of the battle of the smashed up British tanks. About 50% of the tanks were destroyed in 1 hour at close range. You know, brilliant soldiering, very brave by the Chinese. And this was in the final hour of the battle as the British pulled down the valley. The lieutenant had lost his tank. His tank is on fire. He jumps out and he fired on the Chinese with his carbine. And he said the Chinese were very close, about 30 meters away. So the guy who photographed was sort of hiding behind this burning tank as I fired. For Brigadier Brodie, General Brodie, it looks like a disaster, but there's something even worse. While the Fusiliers, while the Ulster Rifles are breaking out down the valley, the Gloucesters on the left flank are now completely surrounded. They're cut off from the brigade. They're cut off from the South Koreans. They're cut off from the entire UN command. They've been fighting alone for 3 nights, and they withdraw to a final position on one hilltop, Hill 235 in Paju, just outside the town of Chumchum. So this is their final position. After fighting for 3 nights against 10-to-1 odds, they're now in 360 degrees defense. And that last afternoon on the Battle of the Imjin River, the guys said, you know, we've been fighting for 3 days. We hadn't slept for 3 days. Many of us had no water. We were really tired. But if you looked around that hilltop, it almost looked, the Imjin Valley, this very beautiful valley, it almost looked like the hills that we grew up in southwest England, very similar. And some of us were just praying. We were praying, make this sunny afternoon last forever, because we know when the sun goes down, the Chinese will attack us once more, we'll be destroyed. And as the sun went down and night falls on the last night of the battle, the battalion padre said, I looked around and in the darkness, all I could see for mile after mile after mile in every direction were just fires burning in the night. And this was from the artillery and from the napalm that was burning all across the Korean countryside. And he said it looked like a vision of Armageddon from the Bible, the end of the world. Sure enough, after dark, the Chinese attacked the Gloucesters, who have now down to about 1/3 of their strength. A lot of men are dying, being given water. Chinese are attacking, this chaos, this close range fighting. And as night goes on, the Chinese are signaling with their bugles. And the British commander says, I hate this bugle sound. Do we have a British bugle on the position? And there was one British bugle on the position. And this becomes the legendary story of the Battle of the Imjin River. he is ordered to stand up and play every British bugle call, just to silence the Chinese. This was a painting taken of that. You can maybe, sorry, it's a little bit dark. You can see him standing up, playing his bugle, just as morning breaks on the morning of the 25th, and the entire battalion is surrounded. And the battle stops because the Chinese are using bugles to signal their men. And I guess the bugles were all listening. What's happening at the top of the hill? Is that one of our guys? And so the British bugler finishes playing, puts his bugle down, and again, for a few seconds, there's just complete silence on the hilltop. Chinese all round, and the battle stops. And then, of course, after the bugle stops, the Chinese start firing all over again, and battle continues. But now it's daylight. And again, sorry, this is a bad picture, but this is a painting of the Gloucesters on their hilltops. And the Americans come in and they drop napalm around the base of the hill. And the Chinese are forced to go to ground. But for the Gloucesters, this is too late. They're now 12 to 14 kilometers from the rest of the UN forces. The rest of the UN forces have gone south towards Seoul, and they've got no ammunition left. They can no longer fight. So Colonel Khan gives his last order to his men. We can't break out as a unit. Every man, try and fight your way south through the Chinese, through the hills, and make contact with UN units. Of course, it's impossible. There are now 10 to 12,000 Chinese in the hills, the Paju Hills, just south of the Gloucester position. Out of 600 men, 63 men escape to UN lines. So for the first time, and the last time since the Second World War, a British battalion is completely destroyed in battle. The Battle of the Imjin River to this day is the bloodiest battle fought by the British Army anywhere in the world since World War II. The brigade took about 1,000 casualties, commanding officer killed or captured, and the Gloucesters were destroyed. And some of you, if you're tourist guides, may have been to the Gloucester Memorial at Hill 235. It's just outside Choksong in Paju. This is what it looks like today. And this was taken about 10 years ago. That's one of the Gloucester survivors, George Newell, who was on the hill in that battle with the Rock Lieutenant Colonel. And that's his daughter. She visited Korea with him, and he could see his old battlefield. This I took 10 years ago, last April. That's one of the Royal Ulster Rifles saluting up the valley during that terrible breakout 60 years after the battle. He died last year. But of course, for the British who came to Korea at that time, Korea was a completely alien country. Rhee Sing-man was arguably as brutal as Kim Il-sung. Koreans were an alien people. We couldn't understand them. But that's changed. Korea today, Koreans have become democratic. They fought for democracy. They won democracy. South Korea is an extremely prosperous nation. It's rebuilt, you know, from the ruins of war. It's a high-tech powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse. People in the UK know Bong Joon-ho. They know Song Hoon-min. You know, Korea is seen as a successful country, and the British government just invited Moon Jae-in to attend the G7 meeting for the first time in recognition of the fact that Korea is part of the family of democracy, in the same way that the Korean people, your culture is different to ours, your language is different, your race is different, but your values, your aspirations, you know, your lifestyle and beliefs are almost exactly the same as British or Western Europeans or North Americans. Korea has been one of the great modern success stories of the 20th century. I think for the soldiers who returned to Korea, despite their horrific experiences in this wasted, devastated land, when they see modern Korea, they're extraordinarily impressed, particularly given how beautifully the graves of the British soldiers are kept down in the Pusan War Cemetery. And one of the British soldiers said to me, you know, what do giving and loving have in common? What do giving and loving have in common? It says giving is loving. It's the same thing. It said, 60 years ago, I gave a year of my life to Korea and I very nearly lost it. But I had no idea what the Korean people had done with my gift. They're democratized, they become prosperous. They've built this amazing, wonderful new nation. And so to the Korean people, I say, don't thank me. It's you who made my life worthwhile. Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free.
네, 마이크 켜시고 질문하실 분 있으면 질문해 주시겠어요? 자, 일단 마이크 켜시고 질문하실 분들 질문해 주시겠어요? 어느 분, 찰리 선생님 하실 건가요? 질문해 주시겠어요?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for your lecturing. And I have some questions. I wonder why the British Army just concentrate on just the Western Front instead of the Eastern Front during the Korean War. After the Korean War, the northern part of the Imjin River was occupied by North Korea. So we lost the Kaesong district, right? Before the Korean War, anyway, the Kaesong city was a part of the South Korea. So I'd like to know the reason why British Army just concentrated on the Western Front.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, imagine this is Korea, right? North, south, Pyongyang, Seoul. If I turn the map in this direction, the high country in Korea is all, on this side, right? This is lower. Korea's kind of like a wedge shape. So if you're traveling north to south in Korea, generally speaking, you'd go down this side of the peninsula. This is too mountainous, right? Yeah. So if you're a traveler, if you're a trader, if you're a warrior, you're probably going from sort of Siniju through Pyongyang to Seoul. Okay, Busan is on this side, but basically the lines of communication in Korea are on the west side of the peninsula. So 2 points. A, the British Army, after fighting in Busan, you're right, was always fighting on the west, because that's where most of the combat was. That's where the heaviest combat was. You can move north and south most easily. But also, one thing I didn't mention is that the British sent a major naval presence to South Korea too. And the Americans, the US Navy was in the East Sea, the Royal Navy and the Australians and Canadians were in the West Sea. So our troops were in the West and our Navy was in the West. And as you probably know, after late 1951, 1952, 1953, the most crucial ground in Korea is north of the Imjin River, right? And Kaesong, because that's the gateway to Seoul or the gateway to Pyongyang. So that was where sort of the best troops were concentrated. So the best American unit was the US Marine Division. They were up there. The best South Korean unit was the ROK 1st Division. They were there. And the British Commonwealth Division were there. So you had these three sort of elite units positioned in that area, sort of Uijeongbu, Paju, north of Seoul, because it's strategic ground.
Okay, thank you.
다른 질문하실 분 누가 하실까요?
You're muted.
Okay, first, thank you for your talk today.
Okay.
Yes, and as far as I know, the UK sent the second largest number of troops, soldiers during Korean War.
Yeah.
And that means many young British soldiers had to be killed in the war. So I'd like to know what was the public opinion about sending troops for the Korean War at the time?
Yeah, no, sure. Basically, remember, this was 5 years after World War II, the greatest war in history. So by today's standards, Korea was a horrible, terrible war. It's far worse than most of the conflicts around the world. But compared to World War II, it was quite a small war. So a lot of people were not familiar with it, didn't know where Korea was, had never heard of Kim Il-sung. Most had never heard of Mao Zedong. They'd heard of Joe Stalin. People weren't really sure what we were fighting for. And of course, the British Army wasn't just fighting in Korea. It was also fighting terrorism in Cyprus. It was fighting in Palestine. It was fighting in Malaya. So there were lots of little wars going on around the world. But I think that the British public were fed up with war. We'd finished World War II. We had no money. Our economy was destroyed. We'd given up our empire, probably for the good. Imperialism's bad. But at the time, that was seen as a bit of a disaster. So the British people, I think, weren't interested in war. And that's why it's called the Forgotten War. There's no great British film or book about the Korean War, unfortunately. That it's dead in popular culture. But as I said, the guys who actually come out here, the soldiers who fought, many of whom were extremely bitter about fighting in Korea. I mean, 100% leave with a very, very, very positive view of South Korea and a belief that actually this was a just war. Because, if the UN hadn't fought, South Korea might look like North Korea today.
Thank you.
네, 누가 또 다음 질문하시겠어요?
제가 해볼게요.
네네.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for your lecture. I learned a lot, Andrew. And I have a question about from the your British reporter journalist perspective. Some people think about the Korean War, it was just the domestic war. And then other people thought about and considered the Korean War as an international war. So I know the Kim Il-sung insisted and then asked the support to Soviet and China. And then, so there are a few controversial opinions, and then I'm wondering your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I won't give you an opinion. I mean, we know the facts now. After the fall of the Soviet Union under Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet Union opened up its historical archives, and under Putin, they've closed again. But for a few years, researchers could read the Soviet archives. And we now know very, very clearly that Kim Il-sung was pushing for the war and was sort of begging Stalin to give him the weapons and the equipment and the backing, because he wanted to reunify Korea, which he tried to do, and he came very, very close to it. So it started out as a civil war, but I think it remained a civil war for just a few days because the Americans came in very, very quickly. And then, of course, it expanded to a UN war. So you had the British, the Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the Turks, I think, had all joined the war by the end of 1950, and then everybody else came later. So it was a UN war very, very early. And then, of course, as we now know, in October 1951, the Chinese entered the war. So it started as a civil war, but soon became an international war. So, both arguments are correct.
Okay, thank you.
자, 그러면 다음 질문은 누가 하실까요? 질문하실 분 있으신가요? 질문이
오케이.
네, 남나리 선생님 하실까요? 아,
I have some small questions.
네, 네네.
Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. It's a nice presentation for Korean War. So in this case of the name of the Civil War or the international wars, I think that somebody this is insisted that, and we have to change the name of Korean War. It's not the Korean War. It should be the Korea War. For example, in the case of Vietnam's, they have spoken that the Vietnam War, not Vietnamese War. So somebody that's insisted it should be Korea War. What do you think about this matter?
To be honest, I've never heard that. I've never really thought about it. I mean, I don't have an opinion. I mean, to me, Korean is the adjective of Korea.
Yeah.
War is the noun, so adjective noun. To me, it makes sense. But like I said, I've never really considered it. So sorry,
Well,
I don't have an opinion.
So somebody that's told this, well, why they call that this is the Korean War? Well, because that's in any other cases, they have told the Vietnam or German or some of the country's name. But in this case, instead of the United States Civil War, anyhow, that's in case of us, they have spoken Korean War. But it should be corrected to the Korea War.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Russian Civil War, the Sino-Japanese War.
Sure.
You know, these are all adjective noun. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
All right. One more question. Well, listen. In case of this in the presentation or any other presentations, we have not found that the movements of Korean armies just after intervention or the invasion of Chinese powers, there's a movement of the Korean and North Korean armies. It means that the shortage of the manpower or that the supplies or that the weapons of North Korean armies. Well, in the contents of your presentations, we have not found that the Korean movement of the North Korean armies. Do you think do you agree?
So I'm not sure if I understand your question, Simon. You're suggesting that North Korea, I mean, in 1950, North Korea didn't have an arms industry. It does now. So their weapons were, I think, largely, the North Korean people's NKPA, the Imingun, was equipped with Soviet weapons, the PPSH submachine gun, the 76mm gun, the T-34 tank. Yeah, they were, and I can't remember, so don't quote me on this, but I think that, Stalin was not giving these things to Kim. He was selling them. I think Kim gave up some maybe mines or some tungsten. It was agreed that he would in exchange for these weapons, but I'm not sure about that.
Anyhow, the main role of this Korean War was taken over to the Red Chinese powers. So instead of the North Korean armies. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the North Korean army was combat ineffective really after Incheon landing and the Battle of Seoul. They did reform, and they came back in I guess mid to late 1951, but without Mao Zedong, without the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, Kim Il-sung and North Korea would have ceased to exist, and the Korean Peninsula would have been unified under the UN flag.
Well, in my guess, if there is no intervention of the Red Chinese armies, there's North Korean parts was wiped out by the United Nations forces.
Yeah. I mean, Stalin cabled Kim when Kim was in Kangye and said, look, I'm not going to support you. Russian soldiers are not going to fight in Korea. So retreat across the border and prepare for guerrilla operations. So Stalin had said, sorry, game over. It was Mao who saved Kim and saved North Korea.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a question.
Okay, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for your explanation and storytelling according to the, get along with the pictures. And then one question is that, is there still a group of British veterans, if they are alive, and are they visiting Korea now? Even though it is in the middle of the pandemic, I mean before the COVID-19.
Yeah.
And, I want to know that the veterans, especially the UK itself, not the union. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, sure. I don't know, to be honest, how many veterans are alive. I spoke to one of the Gloucesters a couple of weeks ago. You know, he's 90 now. You know, these guys, I mean, every Korean War veteran now is going to be in his very late 80s or in his 90s. So, I mean, they're a dying generation. But yeah, I mean, there were hopes that British and American and Turkish and New Zealand and Canadian and Ethiopian would all return to Korea last year for the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the war. Because of COVID, impossible. This year, we were hoping that a lot of British and Australian troops would be able to come back for the Battle of the Imjin River and the Battle of Kapyong, which was the 70th anniversary is this year. Same thing. So I think until maybe we'll see a few will return next year, but their numbers are getting very, very thin.
Yes, thank you so much.
네, 다음 어느 분이 질문하실까요?
To be really honest with you, it was only a United Nations force because at that time, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council because China's seat was being held by Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Kuomintang. It wasn't being held by Mao Zedong, who had taken mainland China. So in protest, the Soviets said, we're not attending the UN. And because the Soviets didn't veto, then the Americans could say, let's have a vote, we'll call it the UN command. Frankly, if the Soviets and the Chinese had seats on the Security Council at that time, I think the Americans would have rallied an international coalition. It just wouldn't have been the UN command. It would have been a democratic coalition or a free world coalition or a Western coalition. But yeah, I mean, it was a unique time in the UN history because the voices that would usually call out against that kind of action were absent.
Okay, so I think it's been a long hour, 2 hours. It's really, you might be very tiring. And I really thank you once again sharing your valuable time, even though you are doing the work. So I want to invite you once again.
Okay, yeah.
To the Imjin Bridge and the Imjingang area.
Sure,
wow.
sure.
Okay. Anyhow, I want to give you the big thanks. 그리고 여기 계신 분들 정말 이 시간에 우리 이거 무료로 하듯이 우리 이 Andrew Salmon, Mr. Andrew Salmon도 저희한테 무료로 해주신 거예요. 사실 이 시간과 노력과 이런 걸 생각하면 쉽지 않은 일인데 이렇게 시간 내주시고 좋은 강의 해주셔서 박수를 좀 쳐드렸으면 좋겠고요. 감사의 인사를 좀 드렸으면 좋겠습니다. 자, 일단 이렇게 늦게까지 해주신 거 정말 감사드리고요. 그리고 오늘 이렇게 좋은 이야기 해주셔서 감사드립니다. Thank you very much. And it was really impressive. And
Thanks a lot.
Okay, Jenny.
Thank you.
A really big lesson.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you again.
네, 저희가 사실 질문 못 하신 분도 있겠지만 저는 개인적으로 이런 느낌을 받았어요. 저희가 DMZ와 판문점을 가고 한국 전쟁에 대해서 많은 얘기를 하는 경우가 많은데 이렇게 정말 처절하게 전쟁에 희생을 하고 한 거에 대해서 들어본 적이 없었어요. 이거 너무너무 슬프기도 하고 감동적이기도 한 얘기인데, 그 남의 나라에 와서 그 19살, 20살의 젊은 청년들이 그 정말 그 죽음을 바로 앞에다 두고 이렇게 처절하게 싸우고 공포와 이 번뇌와 이런 것들이 막 만감이 교차했을 텐데, 이렇게 오고 가는 상황을 저희가 모르고 있었다는 게 너무 죄스러운 생각이 드네요. 아마 이분은 이제 영국 이야기를 해주셨지만 이디오피아, 뭐 태국, 다른 나라도 아마 같을 거라고 생각이 되네요. 그래서 지금 오늘 요 강의를 들으면서 제가 느낀 건, 이분들을 위해서 저희가 할 수 있는 일이 무엇인가를 한번 생각해 봐야 되지 않을까 하는 생각이 들고요. 또 영국뿐만 아니라 이분들한테 어떤 식의 감사의 그 행동과 양식을 해야 될지 한번 생각하게 되는 시간이었습니다.